I believe that communities are the lifeblood of humanity, and that each of us has a deep-rooted desire to be a part of something bigger than any one of us individually. We're all already engaged in so many diverse communities. And in fact, we're living in the most, quote, connected time that the world has ever seen. How many people in this room have used their phone or tablet since the time you've been here to connect with someone or some outside community? Take a look around. How many of you have started a conversation with somebody in the room who you didn't know prior to arriving this morning? A stark difference. So at a time when we are more connected than we've ever been, we actually might be as isolated as we've ever been, spending more and more time on our own with our own devices. Research shows us that more and more Americans, nearly 35%, report that they've never once met their next-door neighbors. And fewer Americans report over time spending quality time on a daily or weekly basis with the people that live right next door to them. We are more connected than ever, and yet sometimes, oftentimes, more isolated. So my desire, my infatuation, my curiosity with how you build community started at a really early age. I was fortunate to grow up in one of the first planned cities in the United States of America. A place built on the values of diversity and acceptance and inclusion and service. A place that knew that if you brought people together, if you intentionally made people collide, you would build a special, special community. And I want to share a few examples of what sociologists more than 50 years ago developed to bring to life this vision. The first example I'll share with you is the example of a community mailbox. So when I grew up, every family had a shared mailbox. You actually weren't allowed to have your own mailbox. And some people thought, well, that's strange. But the idea behind it was that every single day, you had to walk up the street. And in doing so, you bumped into your neighbors. You asked them how their day was, and they asked about yours. And it created this intentional collision. The other thing these sociologists developed more than 50 years ago was the idea of a community pool. Jim Rouse, the visionary developer of this city, decided early on that he didn't want people secluded and isolated in their backyards. So they built community pools that were open and accessible to everyone, whether you lived in a single-family home or an apartment or a townhouse, congregating people together to share in community. And the last and maybe the most audacious example from 50-plus years ago was that of the Interfaith Center, a physical structure that housed multiple faiths. On Friday night, the Interfaith Center served as a synagogue, and on Sunday morning they served as a church. The rabbi's office just down the hallway from the pastor. One physical structure for the community to congregate. And it was an experiment, and it worked phenomenally well. And growing up there, I thought that was normal. It wasn't until later that I realized that most communities were different. And I also realized that while you can design community the way Jim Rouse and these sociologists did in the post-civil rights era, we also have a responsibility as individuals to step outside of our comfort zone and to join a diverse multitude of communities. We've all been involved in these communities in our past, whether they be athletic or whether they be professional or whether they be geographic or religious-based, or whether they be communities that come together around a cause, a social movement like Pelotonia. And a few years ago, I was afforded an opportunity to witness firsthand what happens when people come together to achieve something that none of us could possibly do on our own. To step outside of our comfort zone. I traveled to Tanzania with 15 other individuals, cancer advocates, most of whom didn't know one another at all. And when we got to Tanzania, our guide leader, Chris Warner, sat us down as a group in the hotel. And he said, I've got a question for the group. And we were all eager and anxious, and he said, do you want to climb to the top of this mountain, the roof of Africa, as one group of 16, or do you want to split up into two groups, a fast group and a slow group? He said, I'm going to leave you, and you guys can think about that. When I come back, you can give me your response. Everybody looked at each other. We sort of sized each other up. There was a 22-year-old, a 62-year-old, and everywhere in between. People were wondering, could that person make it? Could that person make it? Could we do this? When he came back, he said, what did you decide? And I said, we're going to go as one group. He said, great decision, but let me just remind you that that means that we will all stand on the top of Kilimanjaro together, or none of us will summit the mountain. He then said, did everybody bring with you the gear that I suggested you bring? And most people nodded. Did everybody bring with you the snacks and the items that I thought would be essential to this journey? And most people nodded. And he said, great, because they no longer belong to you. They belong to the team. And it was in that moment that I learned the idea of what's mine is yours. And in a community, that's how people engage. What's good for the community, what's good for the team, is also good for the individual. And I can tell you that 5 days after that meeting in the hotel, when 16 of us stood on, quote, the roof of Africa, the tallest point in the continent, if you look closely, you can see that I'm wearing a black jacket. A really warm, technical, puffy, incredible jacket that doesn't belong to me. Because 3 hours earlier, around 3 a.m., in sub-zero temperatures, one of my teammates reached over and said, I think you need this, realizing that my jacket was totally, unequivocally inadequate. This journey showed me once again the power of community and how, while we can design community like Jim Rouse did in Columbia, Maryland, we can also each self-select, raise our hands, and join a community that sometimes forces us outside of our comfort zone. When I was growing up, my parents taught my brother and I the difference between a community and a crowd. And I'll never forget what they told us. They said, you know, in a crowd, people push and they shove and they elbow and they try to get ahead of the person next to them, thinking that that will equal success. But in a community, people hug and they smile and they embrace and they look around and they know that in order for any of us to move forward, we all must move forward together. So my humble request today is that before you leave this room, before you go to lunch, before you take the midday break, say hello. Tap somebody in front of you. Turn to somebody behind you. Ask them who they are. Listen to their story. And if we all do that, we can turn this seemingly huge crowd here at the McCoy Center into a vibrant, creative, and transformational and inclusive community. Thank you so much.